We're ready. Shall I begin?
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Renaming Confederate Memorials, A Reckoning with History, using Carolyn Parker Elementary School as a case study panel discussion. I'm Deidre Houchen, Alachua County's Equity and Community Outreach Manager. I'll be the moderator for this event. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the many individuals for their dedicated work in reconstructing the history of Alachua County through the renaming of the Carolyn Parker Elementary School. We'd like to start with Ms. Faye Williams, who worked for years championing this issue. Dr. Jeffrey King, the African American History Task Force, especially Mr. Khalid Blount, who stood as a sole advocate at school board meetings, championing the inclusion of African American history for many, many years. Mr. Joel Buchanan, who is no longer with us, but was a forerunner in documenting the outstanding contributions of African Americans to this county. Of course, Ms. Patricia Hilliard Nunn, who also is no longer with us, but was an outstanding advocate for truth, justice, and the inclusion of African American history into our lives and reality for many, many years. The Gator NAACP, the committee in charge of renaming, and all those who were instrumental in the name change of the Carolyn Parker Elementary School. I'd also like to thank Rachel Khoury and Jackie Davis, who organized this panel on behalf of the Community Education Subcommittee of the Alachua County Community Remembrance Project. I'll begin by introducing our panelists today, providing a brief summary of the life of Ms. Carolyn Parker, and posing some questions to launch us into the discussion. You may contribute to this discussion by posting comments on the YouTube chat that we hope to get to near the end of our talk. We thank you for joining us today. With regard to our panelists, we're grateful and we thank Dr. Rick Stevenson, Ms. Kimberly Gregg, and Dr. Paul Ortiz for joining us today and speaking to this issue. And I'll begin with the biography of Dr. Stevenson. Dr. Robert Stevenson, Jr. is a professor of African American Studies at the University of Florida. Dr. Stevenson holds 2 master's degrees from Fuller Theological Seminary, a doctorate in divinity from the Southern California School of Ministry, and a PhD from Michigan State University in African and American and African Studies. Dr. Stevenson's primary research examines the role of suicide by drowning as a form of resistance during the transatlantic slave trade. His other research interests are in the research and recovery of sunken slave vessels. He also teaches courses in the civil rights movement and the Black campus movement. He is a certified scuba diver and has been involved in multiple underwater sunken slave ship expeditions. Dr. Stevenson is a trained and certified basic pistol instructor. Ms. Kimberly Gregg is an exceptional student education teacher at Carolyn Parker Elementary School, where she taught since 2007. Ms. Gregg was a member of the renaming committee for Parker Elementary School. All 5 of Mrs. Gregg's children attended Alachua County schools, and Mrs. Gregg herself attended school in Alachua County from 1st through 12th grade. Her family's connection to Parker Elementary started in 1999 when her oldest son began kindergarten there. Ms. Gregg participated in the renaming committee for the formerly named J.J. Finley Elementary School as a community member nominated by school board member Tina Certain. Her husband, Steve Gregg, is the lead pastor at Creekside Community Church. Finally, Dr. Paul Ortiz is a Penn Award-winning author. He is director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and professor of history at the University of Florida. His book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, was identified by Bustle as one of, quote, 10 books around race to read instead of asking a person of color to explain things to you. Fortune magazine listed it as one of the 10 books of American history that actually reflect the United States. Paul is a first-generation college student. His pathway to academia included years of organizing work with the United Farm Workers, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, and many other unions. He is currently president of the United Faculty of Florida, the union that represents tenured and non-tenured faculty at UF. He served on the Alachua County School Board's Committee on Renaming J.J. Finley Elementary School in his capacity as official historian of the Alachua County's NAACP. Paul is currently a member of Parker Elementary School's Advisory Council. He has worked with communities in Ocoee, Florida, Elaine, Arkansas, Natchez, Mississippi, and many others on issues of racial and historical truth and reconciliation. We thank you for our distinguished panelists. Now to provide a little bit of background on Miss Carolyn Beatrice Parker. Carolyn Beatrice Parker was born in Gainesville, Florida in 1917 in the midst of the harsh time of segregation and second-class citizenship known as Jim Crow. Her father, Dr. Julius A. Parker, was a physician who graduated from Meharry Medical College, the first medical school in the South for African Americans. Carolyn Parker's maternal first cousin, Joan Murrell Owens, was a marine biologist and was also one of the first Black women to complete a PhD in geology. 6 of Julius and Delia Parker's 7 children completed advanced degrees. A 7th child passed away at 9 years old. Carolyn Parker was educated in segregated African American public schools in Tampa, Florida. She graduated from Middleton High School in 1933. She then attended Fisk University, where she graduated magna cum laude with a bachelor's degree in physics in 1938. Between 1938 and 1940, Ms. Parker taught high school in Gainesville, possibly at the historic Black Lincoln High School. In 1941, Carolyn Parker completed a master's degree in physics at the University of Michigan. She was the first African American woman known to receive a graduate degree in physics. During World War II, while she was only in her 20s, Ms. Parker joined with millions of Americans in the devastating war effort. Due to her superb mathematic and scientific skills, Ms. Parker was recruited to work as a research physicist with the Dayton Project, a division of the Manhattan Project in which scientists worked with the highly radioactive material polonium. Ms. Parker's team was tasked in 1943 with separating and purifying the radioactive element polonium, which was to be used as the initiator for atomic bombs. African American scientists like Ms. Parker encountered a tremendous amount of racism in the Manhattan Project, as their capabilities and skills were often denigrated. In 1944, Ms. Parker's team had achieved a high level of success. separating polonium using acid extraction methods. Due to the top secret nature of the Manhattan Project, few research scientists realized that they were working on the devastating weapon that eventually became the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. For most Americans, World War II was perceived as an existential struggle for human survival. This was the righteous cause that Ms. Parker put her talents to. As a junior scientist, Carolyn Parker played no role whatsoever in decision-making about the implementation of the atomic bomb. Ms. Carolyn Parker used her brilliant mind to execute what she assumed was her patriotic duty. Tragically, Ms. Parker died of leukemia at age 48 before she could earn her PhD. Leukemia was an occupational risk of working with polonium. She is buried at the Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Gainesville. The people of the United States, and certainly Gainesville, owe Ms. Carolyn Parker a great debt of gratitude for making the ultimate sacrifice to our nation. And I'd like to say that that is an excerpt for the summary that the renaming committee provided to the school board in order to institute Carolyn Beatrice Parker as the new name for the once J.J. Finley Elementary School. So I'm grateful to that summary. With that, we'll move on to our first questions. Our first question is for Ms. Gregg. Ms. Gregg, as a teacher, can you talk about the impact of renaming your school? Is this a topic that's been addressed in your curriculum or any school-wide efforts? And what do you think the impact of that name change is for diversity, inclusion, and especially the achievement of African Americans at the Carolyn Beatrice Parker Elementary School?
Yeah, I believe it, I can't remember if it was Mr. Blunt or Miss Williams who pointed out that there was not a school in Alachua County named after a Black female. So Carolyn Beatrice Parker Elementary is very proud to have that honor. The time of the Finley name had passed away for us. It was, I think as we at the school learned more about Judge Finley, the more offensive it became to have the name on our school, which is a very diverse school. We seek to be an inclusive school, so we're pretty excited to have the new name. We a group of us have worked together. We started a group called Teachers for Equity and put together a Google Drive, and different teachers contributed toward that Google Drive, either histories or links to resources, or one teacher did a PowerPoint explaining the name change, and in a way that was understandable to our students. Our students are from ages 5 to 11 and 12. So we need to be thinking about making things understandable to them. But overall, it's been very positive for us.
It sounds as though you're saying that, yes, there are teachers who have addressed the name change in the curriculum, and that has been a positive change and brought some well-needed conversations to the forefront. Is that the case?
Yeah, very much so. And I think in an odd way, it's given us as teachers permission to talk among ourselves about our own experiences. We put together a newsletter, a monthly newsletter. Ms. Katie Allen, who's one of our kindergarten teachers, put together a newsletter, and every month a different teacher writes about their sort of understanding of their identity. So it's been an opportunity for growth for us as teachers, and also to enter more into this conversation with our students.
Thank you. Our second question is for Dr. Ortiz. During the renaming committee process, there was a lot of discussion, Dr. Ortiz, about whether to rename the building after amazing local African-American figures or whether to go with a more generic name. Why was it important that we chose a person, particularly an African-American woman? And what does this tell us about where we are, the zeitgeist of the time, and what we need to focus on moving forward?
Thank you, Dr. Houchen, for the question. And 3 words: Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter international movement, and by the time our committee began meeting, Black Lives Matter had become a global democracy movement, one of the most remarkable movements in modern history. And Black Lives Matter really buoyed and supported so many of these struggles and efforts all across the country, not only to rename existing buildings, but to force Americans, many of them for the first time, to come face to face with their own histories of racial oppression, but also democratic struggle. None of this would have happened without the Black Lives Matter movement, to be honest with you, Dr. Houchen. And and you mentioned many of the folks who were formative, who for years and years, sometimes individually, would get up in front of school board meetings, city council meetings, and really lobby for these types of things. At University of Florida campus, why do we have buildings named after people who didn't work well with the students or were against the civil rights movement, right? But what changed everything was the Black Lives Matter movement. For me personally, it was very important that the school be renamed, especially, and echoing Ms. Gregg, once we found out about Judge Finley and more about his history. This odyssey began for me back in May. I received a phone call one evening from Evelyn Fox, who's the chair of the Alachua County NAACP. And she said, "Paul, I need you to become the official historian for the NAACP of Alachua County." Now, I didn't even know such a position existed, but she said, "You're it. And the first thing we need you to do is to do some serious research on Judge Finley. Tell us who he was, where he came from, and most importantly, should there be a school named after him?" And I just want to emphasize that this is the kind of research the whole committee was doing at a certain point about individuals, about places, about African-American history, some cases, the history of Reconstruction, the history of lynching. It was a group effort. It was really inspiring. And there were some hard moments, but doing the research on Judge Finley, Dr. Houchen, just to respond to your question, it became obvious within just a very short period of time that this man should never have had a school named after him. The fact that there was a school named after J.J. Finley for the better part of 7 or 8 decades is really a tragedy for this community. And when you think about this, I approach this from many different levels, as a historian, as a community organizer, but even as a military veteran. Think about this. We have a school named after a woman who honorably served her nation and who sacrificed and whose life was tragically cut short because of her military service. Her name is on that school now. She replaces a man who violated his oath to the US Constitution. Now, I'm a 3rd-generation military veteran, and I can tell you very bluntly that if you violate your oath to the US Constitution as an enlisted person or as an officer during a time of war, you're going to go either to Fort Leavenworth for your entire rest of your life, or you might be executed. And the fact that J.J. Finley got away with that, but to be honest with you, his service to the Confederacy was almost the least of his problems. If you look at his legal record, This was a man who actually was castigated by his own peers because repeatedly he admitted evidence that was garnered under torture. That's what he's known for in the Florida Bar Journal. And anyone could have done that research, Dr. Houchen. I mean, the reason I call it a tragedy is between the time the school was named after him and the time we renamed the school and last year, anyone could have done that research. It didn't take someone with a PhD to do it. But I think originally when our committee first got together, and I think in your question, you note that we were implicitly under a lot of pressure because there was a poll that was done. I still don't know the provenance of the poll. And we received this poll in the committee that said that a lot of people wanted us to rename the school for a place name, maybe a river, a neighborhood, a bird or something. I can't remember now. This is another important part of what we're talking about too. It reminds me that we have a chance now to gain to kind of gather documents, oral histories, because this is a primer for, I think, how to get it done, how to successfully change a name under conditions of stress. And our committee was under a lot of stress. I want to thank, people like Harley Simon, who chaired that committee, who really stepped to the fore under a lot of pressure. I was almost ready to walk away more than once. I want to thank Karen Kirkman in public, because Karen was one of the people on the committee. She's one of the best historians I've ever worked with. We had an incident, Dr. Houchen, where there were once we decided we really wanted to name the school after an African-American individual, we got all of this barrage of people sending us misinformation about really storied and important African-American figures in this community from Reconstruction to present. And some of the information was good, but a lot of it, frankly, was dishonest. It was malicious. There were attempts to attack, to assassinate the characters of many of the African-American finalists who were on the short list for the school renaming. And I credit Karen Kirkman for preventing me from just leaving the committee one day, because someone had been sending around this email about one of the finalists, Josiah T. Walls, who was a U.S. congressman, a Civil War combat veteran, a person who was born into slavery, who risked his life to serve this nation. And people began circulating really false and really just heinous rumors about this man. And I came to the committee one day and I was so disgusted, I almost quit. And Karen Kirkman stood up in that meeting and she said, "These are lies. This is not true." And so at different points, I guess different people stepped up to really, do the right thing. And it's so important that we continue to do this, Dr. Houchen. I mean, I think that we have this great opportunity where we could continue to rename things in honor of African Americans and other groups, other individuals that have been, typically denigrated in this community. And the Parker story, to me, is such an amazing success story.
Dr. Ortiz, you mentioned so much in your comments, from the importance of every human in being a historian and remembering our past and doing the work to continually retell the histories in a way that's true, period. And the vile history that was uncovered about J.J. Finley during the work that you all as a committee did, and the leadership and how fraught that work was. I'm going to build on that theme and ask Dr. Stevenson a question related to Confederate histories. According to Southern Poverty Law Center, there are over 2,000 Confederate monuments, place names, and other Confederate symbols in public places. There are 11 states that have 23 Confederate holidays, and in Mississippi and Alabama, they celebrate Robert E. Lee Day on the same day as MLK Day. Can you talk a little bit more about this legacy of Confederate history and what it means? Can you tell us more about what it means particularly to us in the South?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Houchen, and to my colleagues, Dr. Ortiz and Ms. Gregg. We are so excited and honored to be here. Just one point of interest, I don't know if you knew this or not, but J.J. Finley and Ms. Parker were both born on the same day, different years, but their birthdays was November 18th. I don't know if you knew that or not, but I thought that was rather interesting as I began to prepare for this conversation. The Confederate holidays are celebrated in Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina. They are also commemorated in Kentucky, Florida, North Carolina, Texas, and Tennessee. All of these states were states that abandoned and seceded from the US during the period of succession. Alabama spends more than $500,000 a year on a Confederate memorial where some Black historical sites can't even keep their doors open. So what we need to consider is that American history has been documented and recorded as, and I quote, white man's history. There's a scholar by the name of Dr. Donald Iacovone. He is an American researcher. He writes primarily on African-American studies and history, but he's writing a book entitled Teaching White Supremacy. And he states, and I quote, white supremacy precedes the origins of the United States. Every aspect of social interaction, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, was dominated by white identity, and white supremacy began to be the expression of American identity. In other words, if you're not white, you don't belong. Iacovone goes on to say this, and this is what really blew my mind. He said, anything that was less than Anglo-Saxon was not a true American. The further along I got in the process, he states, the more intensely this sentiment, not an American, came out. He said, I realized that I was looking at, and there's no other word for it, white supremacy. I came across one textbook that declared on the first page, and I quote, this is the white man's history. And so to answer your question, the celebration and the development of these Confederate monuments, place names, etc., are part of an intellectual movement called the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause was a distorted version of American history that was and still is prevalent throughout the South. The cause that was lost was the Civil War and the perpetuation of slavery and legal white domination by white Southerners over persons of African descent. The memorialized perpetuation of this evil and moral act of servitude began shortly after the end of the Civil War, and it gave rise to the KKK, which continued through the period of Reconstruction, and it morphed into the era of the Jim Crow segregation. It reached a mediocre end during the Civil Rights Movement, but there was and there has been a revitalized effort to return to this ideology of white supremacy, which is evident in the insurrection and the attack on our government on January 6th. The naming of military installations, which Dr. Ortiz spoke to, was one of the crowning achievements of those who sought to perpetuate the lost cause. The intent of the lost cause was to cement the notion of white supremacy and white dominance throughout the South, and never to forget their once held power over African Americans. The intellectual genesis of the historical inaccuracy began with Southern historians. Two of them I'll mention here, one Edward Pollard and another Jubal Early, but it was further executed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The term lost cause was coined by Edward Pollard in a document that he wrote entitled The Lost Cause, New Southern History of the War of the Confederates. The thing that was new is that it wasn't truthful. The rest of the history that we've tried to examine is filled with inaccuracy. So what does the legacy of the Confederate history mean to us today? This inaccurate revisionist approach to history distorts and lies about the true cause and nature of the Civil War. The Lost Cause argued that the Civil War was about states' rights. It also suggests that the war was about the right for each state to choose whether or not it would be a slave state. And there are three basic tenets to the lost cause. The first is that the soldiers who fought for the Confederacy were heroes and not traitors. The second tenet is enslaved people were grateful to be enslaved and that they enjoyed it, and slavery was not bad. And the third tenet was slavery was not the root of the Civil War. I want to go back to the second one. There's no, my area primarily of research is the Middle Past. There's no indication that there were these two Africans waiting on the west coast of Africa saying, you know what, this freedom thing is not always cracked up to be. Let's go to America and be slaves, have our parents sold, our daughters raped. That's not what happened. Our foreparents were stolen and brought here. And so this whole narrative is designed to besmirch the real truth of the legacy of white supremacy and racism. And then finally, what does it tell us about who we are and what we struggle with today? The answer is this. It tells us that we are inconsistent when it comes to remembering and memorializing our history. The purpose of naming a monument or a building is to serve as a reminder of the influence and the productive nature of the person or the family being commemorated. Building monuments create an everlasting objective or perspective of life. And I guarantee you, there is no place in this country where there are Jewish monuments named after Adolf Hitler. There is no Dachau National Park. There is no Auschwitz Recreational Center. There is no Dr. Mengele Medical Complex. There is no Reinhard Heydrich High School. None of these names who were murderers and killers have buildings dedicated to them. And therefore, why should we dedicate these buildings or name buildings or installations after people who are racist and traitors?
You're absolutely right, Dr. Stevenson. You used an interesting word. You said that our memory, we are inconsistent in our memory. And I'd like to offer Mrs. Gregg or Dr. Ortiz an opportunity to address that question as well. Is it inconsistent in our memory, or is it something more nefarious? Or is it something more nefarious? Or is it ignorance? And the belief that Southerners want to just maintain a history that's uncomplicated, that allows them, particularly white Southerners, to not have to grapple with such difficulty. Mrs. Gregg or Dr. Ortiz, any of you, give me a hand and I'll pass the question to you. Dr. Ortiz.
Nefarious. The timing of these monuments and buildings that were renamed, they're not, see, from our vantage point, we might say something like, well, they were just named in honor of Confederate soldiers and such and such. But that's not true. The timing is all wrong, because the heroic building or the wave of building of Confederate monuments happens long after most Confederate soldiers are long gone. The point of those monuments and building names was to celebrate white supremacy, one, and two, to erase Black achievement and accomplishment. During the renaming process, the renaming committee looked at, scores of different names of individuals from all backgrounds. And early on, we had a list of over 30 African Americans who had served politically or in their community during Reconstruction roughly between 1867 and 1876, just in this county. And I told people, look, we could expand that list over to well over 100. And included ancestors of Commissioner Charles Chestnut, for example. It included a man who became the founder of an international African-American newspaper organization, Matthew M. Louis, another Civil War combat hero. It included individuals who garnered international achievement and acclaim. And part of the reason that all of those monuments were created, not just here, obviously, but all throughout the South, was to erase African-American achievements. and to brainwash and propagandize all Southerners to believe that Black people had never accomplished anything. When the reality was, without Black ballots, without Black suffrage, without Black male suffrage, there would have been no public education at all in the South after the end of the Civil War. I mean, you take away Black Reconstruction, and we would have had the same kind of educational system in this county that we had before the Civil War. And that system was designed expressly to serve the white elite, the plantation elite, the plantocracy, not even to serve poor white people, whether they, you know, and see, back then, poor white people knew it. See, now you have this myth of white people all together during the Civil War. This is another thing, Dr. Houchen, that these monuments, now it's always a danger to give a history professor the microphone. But I will mention
I was about to say that.
I'll mention one more aspect of why these monuments and building names are so very dishonest. Number one, they try to give us a notion of a united white South, right? When the reality was that in this state, probably over half of the white men who could have served in the Confederacy either deserted or didn't want to have anything whatsoever to do with the so-called lost cause of supporting slavery. And the evidence comes from the Confederate Army. I've looked at the recruitment books of Confederate recruiters who came to Florida, who were so frustrated because time and time they said, there are no white men who want to serve in the Confederate military. I mean, they're all either overseers in plantations, or salt makers, or ranchers, or ministers. Now, those were four categories of white men who were exempt from the Confederate draft. And these Confederate recruiters were saying, is every white man in Florida a minister? Because we can't get anyone to serve in the Confederate military. And it's only decades after the end of the war that you have this myth of the lost cause of defending the homeland, that the war was about white people just defending their homes, pure and simple. That was never what the Civil War was about. If it was, the Confederacy never would have invaded Pennsylvania. If it was just about home, the Confederacy never would have invaded Mexico and tried to re-spread slavery into Latin America and tried to buy Cuba because it was incredibly profitable. That was really what the war was about. So the lost cause becomes this myth enshrined in these, I'll call them phony, statues. That's what they are.
So Dr. Ortiz, you mentioned, you and Dr. Stevenson very clearly articulate for us that a version of history took over in order to shore up the base of white political power in the South during a time when it was lost and being challenged successfully by African Americans during the Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction period. That's a complex, beautiful, rich history, and one that we are now relearning and redocumenting based on efforts such as the Renaming Committee, the Alachua County Community Remembrance Project, and as you rightly mentioned, the Black Lives Matter movement across the nation. Ms. Gregg, I want to ask you, what is it like to be a teacher grappling with this time where true history is being brought to the forefront and the complexities of how tragic often and certainly difficult American life was during this period are now being discussed in your classrooms, at your school, especially now as we have new revisions of the same kind of struggle and this threat of critical race theory and other politicized versions of what should be taught as history?
I think any good teacher desires their students to have the best education possible. I think part of this process is the realization for a lot of us that that our students haven't always been given that opportunity. They haven't been given the education about their history to put them in a position to understand present day history. So I know at Parker we're working to figure out how we can make our school a place where all our students feel free to invest in their education and find their own growth.
Thank you. Dr. Stevenson, as you mentioned in the book, as you mentioned the lost cause, in his recent book, How the World is Past, author Clint Black also talks about the lost cause. And you named very clearly the purposes of the lost cause. In this country, we definitely have at least two opposing realities. One that contributes to the resistance to renaming, and one that is moving forward with all its might to tell a more complex, richer, truer version of history. Can we teach this truth without furthering the divisiveness that paralyzes the community? Should that even be our concern? And as a professor, is there a path forward that reconciles, not necessarily minimizes, but reconciles the two versions of history operating in the present and in the past?
So what you asked me, can we build a bridge between these differences? I think we have to begin, first of all, with honesty and truth-telling by acknowledging that what has been taught as American history has been deliberately inaccurate. There's a conspiracy to undereducate. There's a book entitled The Lies My Teacher Told Me, and a former high school student wrote an article to the San Francisco Examiner, and he says, and I quote, "I was a poor D+ student until I read The People's History of the United States and Lies My Teacher Told Me." He said, after reading these two books, my GPA jumped up to 3.8 and it stayed there. He says, if you truly want students to take an interest in American history, stop lying to them, end quote. And I think that not only do we have to stop lying to students, but I think we should reduce the amount of social media consumption and begin to digest more accurately and credible scholarship. If you look at Dr. Ortiz's office, I've been there, there's books everywhere. You know, and you look at many of us who are historians, we obviously are connected to social media, but we have to be able to tell the truth, right? There's a book that you might have heard of, it's called the Bible. And it says, the truth will set you free, right? And I think there's a certain level of accuracy to that statement. You know, how can we teach the truth without further disabling and divisiveness? I'm not sure the issue is about teaching the truth. I think the issue is hearing the truth, right? I'm not so sure that teaching is the issue. I think that there are people who, like a person who may be considered racist, where that behavior has become so normal, we become so normalized in not hearing the truth that we don't expect it, nor do we anticipate it. And then when we do it, it's an anomaly, right? Where in fact, if we were accustomed to hearing it, we would desire it. And so is there a path forward to reconciling it? Yes, there is a path. The first step is discontinue the notion that there are two versions of American history. There's only one version. It comes with successes and failures. It has triumphs and defeats. It is riddled with good ideas and some not so good ideas. The question is, why does America feel the need to purport herself as a perfect, flawless experiment? My wife makes lunch for me, and she always sticks little love notes in my lunch bag. The other day, she wrote me a note and it really touched me to my core. I was in the class eating right before class. And she said to me that she loved me because I'm smart and I'm sexy and I'm handsome. And I get that, I understand that, you know, but, but then she says this, she loved me because I never made her cry. And as Black Americans, we love this country, but they've always made us cry because they have lied to us. They have eliminated from the textbooks. They've not been able to, they've not promoted or highlighted our contributions. And for the most part, even as we have gone to battle, and we fought in every single war since the history of this country, we still end up crying at the end. So is there a path to reconciliation? As Americans, we must reevaluate our motives in composing and sustaining history. Remember, it was a lie that led to the genesis of the Aryan nation. And if we're not careful, we will have a similar Aryan uprising here in the US. An example of that is January 6, 2021. We learned from history that in June 1936, powerful, thirsting Himmler, Joseph Himmler, got a full control of the Gestapo and began to orchestrate the murder of millions and millions of people on a lie. And so the truth of the matter is this: if we're going to get back to a place where we destroy these two versions, we recognize that there are failures and there are successes. But the truth of the matter is, honesty and truthfulness in history is what we strive for as scholars and as historians and as teachers.
I agree, Dr. Stevenson, but boy, did you just raise the hornet's nest, given that one of the questions that was raised in the YouTube comment. Mrs. Gregg, this is to you, and take all the time you want, because I know this may be a fraught question. The question that was raised in the YouTube was, are teachers afraid to talk about the history of racial injustice because of the state's position on teaching critical race theory? And as Dr. Stevenson said, we, teachers, scholars, historians, have to be able to tell the truth. Are teachers able to tell the truth right now?
I'm at a disadvantage. I don't know much about critical race theory. I teach young children. I personally teach children with disabilities. They're very concrete thinkers. So I give a lot of thought to how can I represent things truthfully in a way that makes sense to my students. I do not personally teach history. I teach reading and math. But I know some of my colleagues at Parker are struggling with this more and are feeling that the materials that they have are not correctly portraying history, are making it too bland. I mean, they're concrete thinkers, but they're capable of more complexity, I think, than we're offering them. Is that an adequate answer?
It's a complete adequate answer. I'm a former teacher, so I understand that even when you teach elementary school or middle school students, they want to grapple with real life. They want to learn real history. And as you say that you are not familiar with critical race theory, I'll step out of the moderator role and just for a second say I think that's the problem that many of us who are critical race theorists or scholars related to that are seeing, is that the struggle over critical race theory is not the struggle over a racialized history. It's a conflation of two different things. It's a way to use something that's scary and different to stop exactly what Dr. Stevenson was saying, the telling of the truth in history. And it limits our students from being able to do exactly what Dr. Stevenson said, which is become proficient in hearing the truth and learning to grapple with complex ideas. So thank you for your perspective. And we thank all the teachers who are continuing to struggle to add complexity and truth to what they're teaching every day in the classrooms, despite bland or poor materials that aren't representing that. My next question is for Dr. Ortiz. Dr. Ortiz, at times renaming can be performative, and sometimes public figures can get credit for supporting something that seems to help Black communities without actually supporting the difficult, long-standing work for systemic change. Beyond the symbolic, what is the importance of renaming? And I want to provide a little bit of context here. In Alachua County, African-American students continue to score well below the state average for Black students in all standardized test areas, while white students score well above the state average. Our magnet programs exacerbate this opportunity gap, often providing advanced opportunities for the students who already are the most well-resourced in the county. Is there a path from renaming to addressing substantive, systemic change that addresses disparities like these?
Dr. Houchen, I'm going to make an admission right now that would probably shock many of my students. I was a terrible student in K through 12, to be honest with you. I was awful. And in fact, when Principal Brill asked me to serve on the advisory council for Parker Elementary, I was initially stunned because I was, and I told my wife, Sheila, who many of you know, I think I spent more time in detention my first 5 years in school than actually in the classroom. I was a bad boy, bad little boy. I was always getting into trouble, in part because the milieus I grew up in shipyard towns, military towns. The teachers, God love them, did as best as they could with us. But again, to be honest, what they were trained to do with us was just to get us in the military and fight the next war, whatever that war was. So my war was in Central America, but a generation before is Vietnam, a generation before is Korea. More recently, it's been Afghanistan and Iraq. And so in the kind of towns that I grew up in, teachers, they have to adjust their expectations because they know that their children are unless they're in that upper track. You mentioned the magnet system or tracking, which I see magnets and tracking as overlaying. Everything changed for me my senior year in high school, and it happened a little too late. It didn't keep me from going into the military, but I had a white teacher by the name of Don Bidwell, and he put Richard Wright in my hands. He put Ralph Ellison. He put Sylvia Plath. He put Kurt Vonnegut. He put all of these writers that challenged everything that you all are saying. Everything. Ms. Gregg, Dr. Houchen, Dr. Stevenson. Everything that's implicit here is this idea that if the U.S. is the best thing since sliced bread, then we don't need Black history. We don't need ethnic studies. But when this white teacher, Don Bidwell, had me read Native Son by Richard Wright, the scales fell from my eyes. I was like, wow, racism isn't my problem. It's white people's problems. It's the problem of this entire society. When I read Sylvia Plath, I realized, wow, sexism and misogyny are endemic to this society. Now, I didn't have any theoretical framework. I can't pretend I understood all those writers as a high school senior, but wow, suddenly school and learning became exciting for me. And to kind of bring it back to Parker Elementary, we're really at the beginning here. If we connect this to what the Equal Justice Initiative is doing, they're saying, let's not just remember and memorialize the victims of lynching. Let's create a poetry competition. Let's get the students writing about Black history. Let's get them doing, learning expository essay writing skills, analytical skills, research skills. And this is a way I think we get to deal with some of what you rightly referred to as this enormous achievement gap that we've got to deal with. And we can connect it to the struggle to rename. The final thing I'll mention is that this is a national struggle. I think that Florida right now, in terms of critical race theory, Florida and some of these other states are swimming against a great tide, Dr. Houchen. What I mean by this is that Dave Canton, who's a colleague of Dr. Stevenson and I in African American Studies, Dr. Canton and I worked on a wonderful project in Connecticut. The state of Connecticut now requires every student who's going to graduate from the state of Connecticut must take African American history, Puerto Rican history, and Latino history in a 2-course sequence. It's not an elective, it's not an extracurricular activity. You will take Black and Puerto Rican history. California, many of you know, just is in the process of passing an ethnic studies bill. The demand for these things, for true history and exciting history, history that's passionate, and getting back to what Dr. Stevenson said, history that's full of errors, successes, triumphs. History should make you cry. It should make you laugh. It should make you get up out of your seat and just bang your fist on the table or be joyful. It should never be bland and boring. And high school students all across the country, and again, a lot of this is intersecting with the Black Lives Matter movement, but some of it preceded the Black Lives Matter movement. We had a wonderful Mexican American Studies curriculum in Tucson Unified School District that developed in the early 2000s that delivered an incredible academic success story. All the peer-reviewed College of Ed studies about this program in Tucson said, hey, when you have a 95% school district of Hispanic students and you're teaching them about their parents and their ancestors' histories going back to Mesoamerica, wow, they get excited, they get thrilled, they become better writers. They're like, oh, hey, do you know the Mayans were much better than the Europeans in math? Okay, that really helps STEM learning, okay? And so it was this incredibly successful curriculum. What did Tucson Unified School District do to that curriculum? What did the state of Arizona do to that curriculum? They banned it, okay? They struck the hornet's nest though, because the response was that students and parents in the Southwest got active. Students and parents in Connecticut, I can tell you, and Dr. Canton and Dr. Stevenson can tell you, those students, Black and Afro-Latino and Latinx students, day after day after day in the state of Connecticut got up to give testimony. It wasn't just a lone person like Paul Ortiz or Rick Stevenson or Callie Blunt giving the testimony in favor of Black history or Puerto Rican history. It was the students, the high school, the middle school students. And see, this is happening all across the country. It's a moment of great possibility. Now, Governor DeSantis is trying to ward it off. And this effort to make critical race theory illegal, it's not about critical race theory. Ron DeSantis doesn't know what that is. He's trying to get history out of their curriculum and bring it back to this sugar-coated, watered-down version of history.
You mentioned so many important things, beginning with the importance of students to see themselves in the curriculum in order to be excited about learning. And I'd encourage anyone who's watching or listening or is a teacher at a school in Alachua County or a student to weigh into that discussion and talk with us about the ways in which seeing yourself, knowing your story, your mother's story, your grandmother's story, your kin's story, that those stories are part of the curriculum either as life-giving or death-giving when they're absent, or those stories are not the truth as far as you know them. I'd like to talk with you a little bit more about Dr. Stevenson. So you're in African American Studies. talk with us about ethnic studies and what is it and why is it important, not just for the descendants of that particular ethnicity to learn their own histories, but for other people to learn the stories of other people in ethnic studies. Help us understand what ethnic studies is and what it, and where it came about in this nation.
Okay, thank you. So in the 1960s, there was a movement of students. I really appreciate what Dr. Ortiz said about students. The majority of the most significant movements of educational development happened with students, not the hierarchy. It's not normally the administrators who want to change. So in the 1960s, there was a movement called the Black Campus Movement. And these students from all across the country decided they wanted three basic things. One, they wanted more Black professors. Two, they wanted curriculum or education that was relevant. And three, they wanted more Black students or students across ethnic and cultural lines. And one of the reasons for that is this. There was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. You may have heard of him. He is the founder of Black History Month. He's the second African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. The first was W.B. Du Bois, who earned a PhD in 1895. And both of them focus on Black history and the role of African-Americans and their contributions. And the reason that's important is this. There's a place in Africa called Timbuktu. If you ask someone where's Timbuktu, they don't know. But it's really just, it's about 50 miles northwest of Mali. It was the first place where over 700,000 handwritten manuscripts were written by African scholars before the 9th century. Now, why don't we know that? Because you cannot argue that a people are intellectually inferior and then say they wrote 700,000 handwritten documents. And these documents include cartography, they wrote maps, they wrote science, they did mathematics, they did medicine, and a significant portion of those documents were written by women. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that African American studies, ethnic studies, is foundational to women's studies, queer studies. All of these different area studies came out of the Black Campus Movement. So every individual group of people began to realize that white male heteronormativity was bland. It was killing everyone intellectually, psychologically, and emotionally. And so the challenge was to add some sweetness, if you will, to the flavor of education, and that including the role of Blacks and Latinas and Latinx and women. And so where we are today, there's a scholar that I love the quote. She is one of my favorite scholars. Her name is Dr. Marimba Ani, and she says this, and I quote, "It would be the mission of the African social scientists at home and in diaspora to devote their energies to the radical reconstruction of the disciplines in which they are trained. Without such an approach, African peoples run the risk of incorporating the theoretical, mythological, and ideological models of white social science into their own methodologies, thereby unknowingly, watch this, internalizing the values of Western European society." In other words, if we don't begin to think about history and using different methods, we will all begin to think that the only people who did something successful were Europeans. But we need to change our method, we need to change the exegesis, we need to change the hermeneutics, and then invite other people to participate in the conversation. We call that Afrocentricity. Afrocentricity means this. It means to bring the African person from the periphery of the conversation to the center, not to be exclusive, but to demonstrate how we are tangential and connected interdisciplinarity to everyone else.
You just broke down Afrocentricity. You broke down a number of things. I have the ghost of Dr. Hilliard, Dr. Hilliard, Asia Hilliard, all in my heart and brain, and I'm grateful for that. And in the same way that you not suggested, but you rightfully articulated that this move in the 1960s by African American scholars impacted gender studies, women's studies, Asian Pacific Islander studies, etc. We are here again in this very moment, one, protecting the turf of all those people's studies, and also doing the super important work of trying to nurture and support that at the K through 12 level, and support children in recognizing that their identities, their personal narratives, their families' histories have a right to be part of their schooling experience so that they can be inquisitive, learn, and make the change in the world that they want to see. That was part of the link, the legacy of African American secondary institutions, that students would not just become great academic students, but that they would come back and serve their community, themselves, their family, their community, and the world in such a way as to make the world a better place. So that's a battle we all need to be involved in ensuring that students in K through 12 education have that ability. Dr. Stevenson, I see your hand. Is there something you wanted to speak to?
Yeah, I just want to add one quick statement, and I think it is this. I think the fear, or part of the fear, with critical race theory as a theoretical framework and teaching is this, that the older generations will be embarrassed when their young kids realize they lied to them. There is nothing more heartbreaking than to know that your mother or your father or your grandmother or your grandfather was dishonest, because we trust them. And when this history has been taught generatively from generation to generation, and these young kids say, wait a minute, Papa, that's not what you told me. Grandma, that's not what you told. That, I think that is more of a fear than anything else.
I think you're right. And had the African American lawmakers and policymakers during the Reconstruction period had their way in creating a more rigorous public education system across the South, that would not be a question we would have to grapple with nearly 100 years later. But given that the resistance did win and we had a much narrower vision of public education, one that created this lost cause narrative for white individuals and a very sequestered second-class experience, one that often taught about a rich democratic experience for African Americans, that's where we're left with. And we're left with resistance to including this true history, and a real fear around, a real fear that we'll have to grapple with some people will have to grapple with the ghosts of their past and the lies that were told. Is there anybody else who wanted to speak about that, particularly about this resistance to teaching a true history and the work that we're going to need to do in order to creating a more complex narrative, especially in supporting our public school educators and the children who are there hoping to have their flames lit, not dimmed by the experience of going through public education. Dr. Ortiz.
Well, I think you've asked the question of the hour, Dr. Houchen, which is, how can we support each other in telling truths about our shared histories? Because they are shared for better and for worse. We can't go back and redo history now, US history in particular. But we have to teach it and learn about it. And to me, trying to find ways to support teachers who are trying to do that, whether that's, providing content. I think, you acknowledged in your introduction about Carolyn Parker, that precious knowledge came out of this collaborative process of research. It drew on some oral histories that have been done with the Parker family. It's just the beginning. There's so much more. I mean, we could write, there's the potential to write a book about Carolyn Parker. let me share with you some experiences of some parents that I know. I mean, my Sheila and I, our son is much too old to go to Parker, but I have, we have staff people who have children currently at Parker. And one of them came up to me shortly after the renaming and was so excited. Well, actually, it was after the new marquee, Carolyn Beatrice Parker came up. And it was an African-American parent. And she was so thrilled because she said that she had two children at Parker. Was very proud of the academic history of the place and really is excited about her children there. And she said, it was so thrilling to be able to explain to my young children why the name had changed. They were just so amazed that there's a Black female scientist and that she could talk to them about. And her young girl was like, I didn't know girls could grow up to be scientists, because wherever she was getting information from, social media, TV, I don't know, Black female scientists are just not a thing. But now they're a thing in Gainesville. Now we have the opportunity to use Parker as a platform to get back to this much more accounting of the history. And it doesn't have to be, and now I may sound a little wishy-washy here, but it doesn't have to be all bad and negative. Now, my work is associated with kind of harsh stuff like emancipation to trade, African-American Latinx history of the United States. Sometimes white readers will contact me, will say, oh my gosh, Dr. Ortiz, I felt so bad when I read your book or books or something, but that's not what I'm trying to do. The reality is there are so many incredible white individuals who we talk about as well in this history. When you talk about the American Revolution, I mean, my gosh, why not talk about Thomas Paine, someone who is opposed to slavery, opposed to the exploitation of women. A lot of my UF students the other day brought up John Brown. They said, Professor Ortiz, can you tell us more about this character? There's this popular TV show about John Brown. I didn't even know, my gosh, a TV show about John Brown? That's revealing. This is the new zeitgeist, right? And so we had a 30-minute conversation about this amazing white man who lived out the courage of his convictions and was so anti-slavery. I mean, all to the bitter end, right? And so, yeah, to me, it's so exciting, the possibilities. And I'll end my comments going back to this point that Dr. Stevenson mentioned. If you look at the 60s, the birth of ethnic studies, one of the iconic events was what we call the Chicano blowouts in East Los Angeles in 1968. Thousands of Chicano and Black and white students walk out of their classrooms, go on strike to demand what? The right to learn more, the right to read more about their people's histories, history from below, people's history we talked about before, lies my teacher told me, right? And the same thing's happening again. And I see it all across the country. I just finished a session with high school students in Central California, and they raised the same questions, Dr. Houchen, that you raised at the outset. How can we get to truth in history? Here is an anecdote that really amazed me. I asked them, what was the last book you read as a class? And 95% Chicano students, many of whom their parents are migrant workers, construction, work in the back of restaurants. And their teacher, and this reflected very well on their teacher, had them read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And I was like, wow, tell me about The Jungle. Like, what did you learn from that book? And they were so excited to talk about learning about Jewish, Lithuanian, Polish working class history. And they had the capacity to connect it to their own histories. And he said, well, and this gets back to, I see a comment in the chat bar about critical race theory, capitalism, and systems of power in place. Get ready to be blown away. Because these high school kids told me, I said, what's the most important question that comes to you out of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, a book published by a white author in 1905? And they said, the number one question is, how can we end exploitation? Because the kind of exploitation that he talks about, that those meatpacking workers in Chicago were subjected to, and by the way, almost all of them were immigrant workers, the same kind of exploitation those are the stories we hear every night around our kitchen table. Our mothers and fathers are bitterly exploited today in 2021. And this stuff started at least in 1905, right? When is it going to end? How can we end it? And I said, you all have just asked the most important question you can possibly ask. You connected history to the present. So it's happening all over the place now. I don't think Florida is strong enough to stop it. Although some of our leaders apparently want to do it, they're fighting against history.
I think you're absolutely right. And you brought up a very important point, and that's the importance of, it's not just that African American or a person's own history helps them to see themselves in the curriculum. It's that it helps you to see universal truths and struggle and the reality. You have to be able to connect that to yourself before you can understand some abstract thing. And that's what we're missing so often in recognizing that we need to ensure that people are engaged, connected, and that their own realities are connected, are represented in the curriculum, if we in fact want them to solve complex social problems happening in the world today, if that is in fact the aim of our education system. So we've got about a little less than 15 minutes left. I want to ask a final question to the panelists, perhaps pivot to a quote that was posed in the YouTube chat if we're able. But the final question, and Dr. Ortiz, you've alluded to this several times, is where should we focus next? And you've said over and over that we're just beginning. Are there other monuments, physical, such as the former J.J. Finley School, systemic, such as the opportunity gap, or psychological, such as this lost cause narrative, that you believe we could begin tackling together in this very county? Is there anyone who'd like to start answering that? And I'll ask each of you to weigh in on that question, please. Dr. Ortiz.
Well, the good news again, and Dr. Houchen, I'll say in front of everyone, I know this may embarrass you, but you are on the forefront of this educational struggle yourself. Your work on behalf of the Alachua County Remembrance Committee, your work as a community educator, as a public-facing educator. When I think of your work, I think of a person that Dr. Stevenson mentioned earlier, Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson is sometimes known as the father of, well, initially the father of Negro history and then later Black history. But the thing that Dr. Woodson assumed was that it wasn't good enough for those of us who've had the great privilege of getting advanced degrees. It's not good enough for us to just teach in the classroom. We've got to get out there. We've got to promote our work in the community. Imagine, Dr. Stevenson, for a moment, that if Dr. Woodson, if he would have had access to social media, what he would have done with it, right? That would have been a sight to see. But I think, Dr. Houchen, getting back to your question, this work is already it's already going on, and we need more people to join us. We've alluded to the Alachua County Remembrance Committee and the work in documenting anti-Black violence, work on documenting the hidden figures, the people who we had forgotten, and getting them back into the forefront. Our connections to the Equal Justice Initiative and the wonderful work that they're doing at Montgomery, Alabama, in changing the discussion, a magnificent national memorial, peace memorial and justice memorial to the victims of lynching. And so many people in the Remembrance Committee and others, and I see Dr. Sharon Austin, E. Stanley Richardson, our poet laureate, Jackie Davis, all these incredible people, Rachel Corey. There's a lot of people doing the work. And so we're like on the freedom train, if I can borrow an old metaphor from the 60s. We need more people to get on that train. There's a lot of exciting work to be done. You don't have to be a parent. You don't have to be a student. You don't even have to be an educator. Go to a school board meeting, call your local principal or, local, a teacher and say, what can I do to support you in the work you're trying to do to get the truth taught, right? I mean, that's one thing that you can do. The other thing is get involved in this discussion. If you don't know what critical race theory is, for example, look at the state rule that was passed by the Commissioner of Education. That rule is insidious in the sense that it's my reading of it, it isn't really aimed against critical race theory per se, because again, very few people teach that. You know, the joke is, if your child is being taught critical race theory, congratulations on getting them into law school, because that's generally the place where it is taught. It's a very advanced theory. I generally only teach it when I'm working with my advanced graduate students. But what the state of Florida is trying to do, unfortunately, and again, I think this is against the tide of history, but they have passed this rule that's designed to get us to limit our discussions about racism and transform those away from a discussion of systemic racism into racism as just a matter of individual choice. And that's exactly what the rule says. Now, that would be comforting to imagine that racism is just a matter of individual choice, but it is not. It is a system of oppression. But the good news is if you get involved with any one of these initiatives that we've been talking about, the struggle is already ongoing. You don't have to make it up, in other words. You can join something. We're very blessed to have this incredibly vibrant network. You mentioned Dr. Patricia Hilliard-Nunn, Joel Buchanan. My gosh, I can remember Joel giving, you know, his Black History Month was like 30 days of and when I say 30, he fit 30 days into 28. He was constantly in high schools, middle schools, UF, Santa Fe. I mean, yeah, the work is really exciting.
Thank you. And you mentioned the work of the Alachua County Community Remembrance Project. I don't know if Tristan, if you or Jackie are able to take the link that I put in the Zoom chat and post that on the YouTube chat. Immediately following this event at 6 p.m., the Micanopy subcommittee is holding their first community forum. Now, these community forums are critical. The way that the Equal Justice Initiative structured the work around the nation is that a community has to say that they're interested in getting involved in this, in excavating this history of racial lynching, and put together a subcommittee from that region in order to start sharing that history with the community. So we congratulate Micanopy on hosting that event tonight. We hope that people will join that event. And I also just want to share with you that October 23rd, the Gainesville subcommittee will be hosting the installation of the historical marker commemorating racial lynching, commemorating the victims of racial lynching in Alachua County at the Alachua County Administration Building at 10 a.m. So we'd love for you to join us for those two events happening. Now, if I can pass the mic to Miss Gregg and let Dr. Stevenson round us out and give us our last comments. We've got only about 7 minutes here. Can you talk to us, Miss Gregg, about what's next from your perspective?
What's next for us at Parker? We've been very handicapped by COVID. We had plans for a big celebration of our name. Our desire is to invite family members of Miss Parker's to really gather the community together, and COVID is preventing us. But we will persevere in that. I did want to a word that Dr. Stevenson said. He said the word relevant, and as I think a lot of our students don't see their education today as relevant to them. And so I hope that that the renaming of the school and things like that could help us as teachers to gather our students into the relevance to them of their education, because that's, I want my students to be able to add, subtract, multiply, divide, and read 100 correct words per minute. But I also want them to be further developing their identity as people and community members. So schools have a lot. We have a lot on our plates. We have a lot we're trying to do.
You do. And the entire public education system, I would say, is struggling with the question of relevance. And we really appreciate you continuing to work on that at Parker, especially with students who have special needs and challenges and that class of students as well. Dr. Ortiz, I see your hand raised. We got
Just
5
applauding.
minutes left.
Just
Oh,
applauding.
that's clapping. Thank you very much. So Dr. Stevenson, if you will utter our final words to us on this panel.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on what Ms. Gregg said. There's a book entitled Black Students and the Racial Reconstitution of Higher Education. It's written by Dr. Ibram Rogers. His name is Kende now. You may have heard of him. He used to teach here. But in the book, there's a quote that I use in mostly all my classes, and it says this, and I quote, "A relevant education is one that interrogates progressive African-American and third world literature and provides students with the intellectual tools to fix a broken society." An education has got to, one, expand the student's perspective to understand the world that they live in and the world around them. Two, in order to provide them with tools to repair the broken society in which we live. Now, if we can say society is not broken, then we don't need a relevant education. But society is severely broken. And if there's anyone who's going to fix it, it's going to be the students. Because as we know, those of us who've seen administration, the higher ups are not concerned about some of this stuff. And the second thing I want to say, and to close with this, is African-American studies as a discipline keeps in the forefront of its function the town and gown. We are responsible not only for the gowns that we wear, but the towns in which we invest. Our responsibility is to take our education from the ivory towers into the communities. And as Dr. Ortiz articulated, we need to be in those schools working with Ms. Craig and other teachers who don't know or don't have access to what we have, and bring that to them in such a way that it is pliable and palatable for their students. So when those students graduate, they can say, my education is relevant, and I'm prepared to fix a society that is severely not only hampered, but broken.
Thank you very much. And we look forward, absolutely, to more conversations that break that town-gown divide, and to building on the work of the renaming committee, on all of those in the past and in the present who have continued to tell the truth about American history and arm our community and our citizens with that knowledge. I do want to correct something I said. I talked about students who have special needs, and I know a lot of students who have disabilities do not prefer that term, and language matters. So let's be clear and talk about students with disabilities and not perpetuate some idea of special needs, which we all have, frankly, and that doesn't separate those students. So on behalf of Alachua County Community Remembrance Project, the Community Education Subcommittee, we thank those who were here and who joined this panel for watching and for making your comments along with us. Dr. Ortiz, Mrs. Gregg, and Dr. Stevenson, I thank you so much for your intelligence, for the work you're doing, and for giving us the time to really deal with these issues in a complex way. And I hope this offering is something that the community finds valuable. We appreciate you being here with us. And on behalf of Alachua County, I'm going to sign off as the equity manager and say thank you so much. And I pray that everybody has a wonderful day today. That's all. Thanks, everybody.
That's it. That's all.